In this episode, we're going to cover some familiar ground as we talk about Articles 9 and 10, the articles on baptism and the Lord's Supper.
We'll approach these articles in two ways. The first way is from a historical, somewhat objective point of view by making note of how the genre and context of these articles is distinct from what we discussed in earlier episodes as we dealt with baptism and the Lord's Supper in Luther's Large Catechism. Secondly, we'll look at the language of each article and reinforce how Melanchthon is setting forth the Lutheran distinctions concerning the sacraments.
We'll start with baptism in Article 9.
You might be struck with how concise the wording is. It's short and sweet. So much so that there was little that could be called into dispute. Therefore, the Roman Confutation accepted and approved the article without exception.
Historians recognize that Melanchthon intended to avoid conflict in this area, given the immediate consequence of being accused of heresy with the sacrament of baptism.
Nonetheless, while on the surface it would seem best to avoid conflicts, the vague language Melanchthon employed regarding baptism would later cause much grief and conflict in later conversations amongst the Lutheran parties.
See what happens when you get lawyer-like minds involved?
Nice try, but not quite. It was Melanchthon's attempts to minimize the risk of offending someone that actually created bigger problems later on. So let's take a closer look at the article and its ramifications, and as the old adage says, the devil is in the details, or in this case, the lack thereof. To be sure, Melanchthon chose his words carefully in this article. He avoided any language that would cause the papists concern. Instead, Melanchthon shifted the focus of the article on a common opponent both the Lutherans and the Roman party had, the Anabaptists.
Clearly, Melanchthon intended to demonstrate that the Lutherans had nothing in common with the Anabaptists, those who refused to baptize infants.
Right. Association with the Anabaptists would have implicated the confessors with a tumult that resulted from the Peasants' War just a few years earlier. We call that guilt by association.
This is one of those times we can see how the political and societal context influenced the composition of the Augsburg Confession. In other words, we can see how external pressures brought about a need to be vague on some important doctrinal matters.
On the surface, the language provides room for agreement. But below the surface, it's clear that the Roman Catholic understanding of baptism and its relation to original sin and faith is very different from Luther's understanding.
The distinctions are evident in the criticism Johann Eck leveled at the Lutheran teaching just prior to the Diet of Augsburg. Recall how he sent out 404 articles that set forth the problems the papists had with Luther's teaching. On the topic of baptism, Eck criticized Luther's understanding that baptism by itself does nothing for salvation.
This gives us the opportunity to unpack some of the distinctions between the Roman Catholic understanding of the sacraments as compared to our Lutheran teaching. We're going to take a few moments to do this because the confusion between a Roman Catholic understanding and our evangelical understanding is often lost amongst both lay and clergy in our congregations. So Chris, why don't you start us off here?
Sure. Eck accurately identified an important distinction with Luther's understanding of baptism. Often, the distinction is voiced from a person in the pew when they ask the question, does baptism save? Eck recognized that Luther understood that baptism by itself does not save. There must be faith in the word of promise given in baptism for there to be a saving effect.
For those of us who love wordsmithing, you can really see the delicate dance Melanchthon needed here in his use of language. The Anabaptists didn't believe baptism saves, but only faith. Luther asserted that baptism establishes the faith that receives baptism. And Melanchthon did not want to be accused of heresy and siding with the Anabaptists.
Another distinction between the Romanists and the evangelical confessors has to do with the function of baptism in the life of the Christian. For Rome, baptism is an initiation and a giving of initial grace that washes away original sin. For Luther, baptism is the event of dying in sin and a new person being resurrected into the grace of God. This event is begun in baptism, but not brought to full completion until death.
You can see why Lutherans emphasize the word of promise placed in the water. The promise is that one will be drowned in a death like Christ's, and on the last day, be raised in a resurrection like Christ's.
Explain a little more, Sarah. Why does this distinction between Rome and Lutherans matter?
Well, it has to do with the impact of sin. For the papists, and you can see how this understanding is at the heart of the indulgence controversy. For the papists, sins, concupiscence, after baptism impact one's standing before God. So for Rome, grace is poured into a person through baptism, but removed from a person through the act of sin. Thus, the sacraments following baptism are the solution to dealing with these sins.
Right. Whereas for Luther, when one clings to the promise given in baptism, no sins apart from unbelief can condemn a person. They're what Luther called flea bites or puppy sins. In a later episode, we'll discuss how this is reflected in the evangelical understanding of penance and confession. But for now, you can start to understand how divisive the views on baptism can be unless one simply keeps it short and simple. Recognizing the radical difference between Luther's understanding of the function and efficacy of the sacraments, we can now turn to Article 10 on the Lord's Supper. We can start by once again looking at the historical context of the article. Again, we can see how the situation dictated the need to be brief with language so as to not make room for offense or for giving the appearances of directly opposing the papist teaching. This becomes very clear when one looks at the difference between the German text and the Latin text.
And this is one of those places the differences between the two texts can make a lawyer's brain hurt. The Latin version is quite a bit softer and more ambiguous, and the German text is quite a bit sharper. For example, while the Latin text states simply that, quote, the body and blood of Christ are truly present and distributed in the supper, end quote, the German text adds the word true to the body and blood. While this may at first seem fairly insignificant, what that one little word true does is to eliminate any possibility of understanding Christ's presence as a spiritual presence. And this was, of course, at the center of Luther's dispute with the Zwinglians at the Marburg Colloquy. So the German text is taking that issue on directly. At the same time, the use of true also dances around the substance language that would highlight the differences between Rome's teaching on transubstantiation and the Lutheran understanding of real presence.
You might need some Advil now, Sarah. Yet another example of the softer approach Melanchthon takes in the Latin text as compared to the German text is how he deals with those with whom the confessors disagree. In other articles, Melanchthon uses words like we condemn or we reject opposing views or beliefs. In the Latin version of Article 10, however, he uses the word disapprove, obviously a much softer word than condemn or reject. The German text, though, does use the word reject.
And remember, the Augsburg Confession is considered to be, and actually is, a foundational document for Lutherans even to this day. But as you're seeing, there are two versions of the confession, with some fairly consequential distinctions.
It's important to keep in mind that we can't look at Article 10 in isolation when talking about the Lord's Supper. Article 13, on the use of the sacraments, certainly is critical to any discussion of the Augsburg Confession's treatment of the Lord's Supper, as is Article 5 on the ministry of the Church. Article 22 on the distribution of both kinds, in other words, the bread and wine, and Article 24 on the Mass. So, be sure to think about all of these articles when thinking about how the Augsburg Confession lays out the confession on the Lord's Supper.
The computation, too, appears to recognize the ambivalent way Article 10 is written. They do criticize the article for its failure to be more explicit in affirming the Romanist position that a change in the substance of the bread and wine occurs. And they criticize the article's failure to condemn those who deny the real presence of Christ in the sacrament. And this is where Melanchthon comes into some criticism from the Lutherans, actually. Chris, why don't you explain this one?
Why, your brain's still hurting? Melanchthon had the opportunity in the Apology to address the Confutation's criticisms directly. In other words, he could have stated openly the position Luther and his fellow reformers took that we do not confess to a metaphysical change in substance to the elements. but rather we stick with the words of Scripture, that when Christ says, "This is my body, this is my blood," so it is. We hang our hats on because Christ says so, not on our ability to prove philosophically how it is the bread is Christ's body.
In the Apology, however, Melanchthon actually gives tacit approval to the computation statements by simply noting Article 19 is approved by the computation. And then he writes approvingly that the Greek and Roman churches agree in their teaching of the bodily presence of Christ. In this approval, he actually uses the word mutare, or changes, twice when discussing the elements and the bodily presence of Christ, the same word the computation uses in demanding the Reformers agree with the Romanist teaching on the Lord's Supper. At this point, it is very fair to say Melanchthon is intentionally obscuring the differences between the confessor's position on the Lord's Supper and the Romanist position.
To add to that, in Article 10, as in Article 9 on baptism, there is no mention of faith, a critical component of the Reformers' understanding of baptism. But this is where it's important to be sure not to read Article 10 in isolation.
Right, because Article 13 on the use of the sacraments makes it clear that while faith is not included in the definition of the sacrament, it is certainly included in connection with the use of the sacrament. We'll talk more about this when we get to Article 13. But for now, we don't want you to think Melanchthon omitted all discussion of faith with regard to the Lord's Supper.
As mentioned earlier, there are deeper issues at stake in the topics of the sacraments. So as to avoid outright dismissal, Melanchthon clearly used language judiciously. For this reason, among others, we want you to avoid the trap of proof texting the Augsburg Confession, but instead look at the whole of the Augsburg Confession.
Nonetheless, as we'll discuss in future episodes, these topics resurface in the years following the Augsburg Confession, and as they do, more of these same issues and distinctions are exposed, something we'll continue to unpack as we work our way through the Book of Concord.
How does it go? Those who don't know their history are bound to repeat it?